Good morning, everyone. Sorry, my built-in microphone is not very good, so I have to put the headphones with a little microphone on. All right, so what I have today is basically sort of a book report. So for my master's program at IU, I'm writing a paper on Buddhism and politics, and the sort of approach that I'm taking is looking first at what early Buddhism might say about politics. Then I want to sort of move into a more kind of Mahayana perspective, and then finally look at some of the modern engaged Buddhist movements that we've seen more recently. So today I'll be talking about the first part, which is, early Buddhism's comments, to the extent that they exist, on politics. So I should just point out that, this is one side of the story. I'm not necessarily advocating that this is what we should all do, because it's generally a pretty apolitical kind of approach to things. But it's just one side of the story. There are many ways that we can interpret this. Obviously, during the Buddha's lifetime, there were no representative democracies, so it was a pretty different situation. A little bit about sort of why I wanted to do this. So I'm from the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So I grew up, steeped in politics. Went to school with, friends who were sons of politicians and ambassadorial retinues and whatnot. And my own family was, while not involved directly in the government, very kind of politically minded. So it was something that was discussed a lot at home. And, after becoming a Buddhist, the topic comes up a lot as to sort of what we should do, regarding political action as Buddhists. And so, I've never really investigated this deeply kind of from a scriptural perspective. So that's sort of what I wanted to do here. Because I think that we have a tendency to sort of import our existing political beliefs into our practice and then try to sort of graft those on. We don't really start from first principles, so to speak, within the Buddhist tradition. And I think that this, has some dangers. It may work, but you can also kind of do it from the opposite perspective that would be normal here. So, in Asian countries, for example, there are Buddhist monks who are vehemently anti-Muslim, for example, and they're able to justify that, in strange ways. Not that I would advocate that at all. But my point is you can sort of graft anything on and make a weird story as to how it fits. But, at some point, I think it's helpful to sort of go back to the beginning of things. All right, so in that regard, there are a couple of important Western sort of biases that we have just as people that, grew up in the West. And these sort of contrast pretty sharply with some of the, Buddhist assumptions. First of all, there's this notion that kind of political participation is morally good. That's kind of a pretty strong Western principle. You see it, starting in Plato's Republic, for example. He says that a truly rational kind of moral being has to be involved in politics. And, this continues throughout sort of the Western philosophical tradition. Up to, for example, Locke, who is very important in kind of the inspiration of crafting some of the principles of American democracy. Another thing that is an important sort of assumption that we have is that morality is sort of absolute. This comes from the Christian tradition, that we have to be moral people because it's kind of ordained from a divine source, from our creator. Buddhism's approach is kind of interesting. Morality is not like that in Buddhism. The idea is, you can be a bad person, but it will be bad for you. So you probably don't want to do that. But you don't have to be a good person. It's just in your benefit to do so. So it's sort of similar, maybe end result, but kind of a different underpinning. And then finally is notions of the self. So obviously in Buddhism, we hopefully embrace the idea of no self. But the Western orientation is totally different from that, of course. The Christian tradition obviously has a soul. And most kind of Western philosophers, work with this in various ways. And it's not until, very recent Western philosophy that you get people that, work towards perhaps rejecting the idea of a self, starting with Hume, who interestingly was probably in contact with Catholic missionaries who were in contact with Tibetan Buddhists. All right, so let's see. Got a big document of notes here, so. All right, and another thing too is that, Western traditions tend to value thinking quite a bit, like what goes on in your mind. And sort of just having some kind of view is itself kind of a moral act. And this, I think, has a lot to do with the Protestant doctrine of faith alone, that you can be saved just by having faith. Buddhism isn't like that. You can't just decide, yeah, like the Buddha's ideas are great, and then expect anything to happen. The idea of our tradition is you have to put these things into practice, or else nothing happens. So that's a very different kind of orientation. And I think that we see this in politics too. There tends to be kind of a lot of emphasis on having the right kind of opinion and not necessarily acting on it. All right, so as kind of a starting point for this discussion, it's worth noting that, one of the most commonly told stories about the Buddha is that, when he's born, there's this prophecy that he will either become a great king or a great religious leader. So in some sense, he could have chosen to be a king, and he could have justly ruled his kingdom and enacted policies that would have been, beneficial for his people. But he chose not to do that. So we need to sort of investigate deeply why that might be. And this kind of, there's further sort of hints in this direction as well. So there's a sutta where, well, I'll read it here. Let's see, which one is this? So this is called the Raja Suta. Raja means king, so the King Sutta. It's pretty short. So it goes, I have heard that on one occasion, the Blessed One, the Buddha, was staying among the Kosalans in a wilderness hut in a Himalayan district. Then, as he was alone in seclusion, this train of thought arose in his awareness. It is possible to exercise rulership without killing or causing others to kill, without confiscating or causing others to confiscate, without sorrowing or causing others sorrow, righteously. Then Mara, the evil one, knowing with his awareness the train of thought in the Blessed One's awareness, went to him and on arrival said to him, yes, exercise rulership, Blessed One. Exercise rulership, O one well gone, without killing or causing others to kill, without confiscating or causing others to confiscate, without sorrowing or causing others to sorrow righteously. And without going through the whole thing, that kind of passage repeats a few more times, as is typical of these things. But ultimately, the Buddha says, no, the entirety of a mountain of gold, of solid bullion, even twice that, wouldn't suffice for one person. Knowing this, live evenly in tune with the contemplative life, and so on. And then Mara, the evil one, sad and dejected at realizing the Blessed One knows me, the one well gone knows me, vanished right there. So this, I think, is kind of an interesting passage because the Buddha's sitting there thinking, oh, I could be, a great king and help people. And then, Mara shows up and says, yeah, do that. And then he's like, oh, okay, I see now that this is, a bad train of thought, and Mara's just trying to sort of trick me here. So this sort of subtext seems to be that, his path that he's already chosen is in some sense, superior to enacting good policies as he sees it. So the book that I read, it's called Buddhism and Political Theory by a person named Matthew Moore, I think he's like a political scientist. He doesn't explicitly identify as Buddhist, but he seems very sympathetic to Buddhism. And so I'm going to sort of just go through his analysis a little bit. And he tries to basically piece together, what we can call a Buddhist political theory from early texts. And the things that he identifies as being important in that regard are the concept of no self, what he calls limited citizenship, and I'll explain that. And then also this idea of what he calls hypothetical ethics, which is what I already sort of explained, this idea that you don't have to do good actions, you just should because it's good for you. And then in contrast to that, the Western tradition has a self. We have normatively obligatory politics, as he calls it, which means, you're supposed to participate in politics. It's good for you. And then also normative ethics, so the idea that, moral goods are sort of absolute. There's a conditional or, sort of an imperative that you be good. So this idea of limited citizenship that he talks about, the basic idea here is that politics is important, sort of inevitable, and it also may bring benefit, just like we saw with the Buddha thinking about this idea of, what if I was a king? I could do great things. But ultimately, other things are considered more important and perhaps have potential to bring even greater benefit. So he looks at a few different Western philosophers too that hold similar views, including Thoreau and Epicurus in the Greek tradition. So in the Buddhist sense, then, practice is this thing that is held to be more important than, engaging deeply in politics. I should also mention here that politics is sort of in the strict sense. So, in some, expansive definition, anything can be considered political, but what we're talking about here is sort of direct interaction with the government in some way, or laws, and so forth. And what he calls this, and it's sort of interesting, he calls this a case of moral pluralism. So the idea is not that, it's bad to be involved in politics necessarily, and that it's good to, practice the Buddha way. What this says is actually both are good, and they both have potential benefits. But we have to sort of weigh which one is ultimately more important to us. And so it's not one is right and one is wrong. It's just that perhaps one is more likely to bring a benefit than the other. And he sort of paraphrases this line from Rousseau in this regard. And he says that, this is the author of the book, Moore. So, good laws cannot make good citizens, and bad citizens cannot make good laws. So the idea here is that in Buddhism, we're working directly sort of at the individual level to improve ourselves and those immediately around us, and essentially producing good citizens. So what this line is saying is that just by having good policies, you can't necessarily make the people good. And if the people are bad, they're not going to make good laws. So at some sense, you have to start from the ground up. And that's what Moore sees Buddhism as trying to do, to essentially create good citizens, which will in turn, create good government in the long run. All right, so let's continue here. Just give me a sec to scroll through my various notes here. All right, so the relevant early Pali texts. So the first one that he talks about is a text called the Aggañña-Sutta. And it's a really interesting text. And it's also a case where sort of we can pick out like individual political issues, I think, and see that Buddhism does clearly seem to have a view on them. But whether or not it has a kind of grand vision is less clear. So this is, and also, another reason that the sutta is interesting is we often hear that, there's no kind of creation story in Buddhism. And while this isn't exactly a creation story, it is sort of like an attempt at like an origin story for sort of how we came to be where we are without having any kind of explicit creator. So this translates actually as the origin of the world. So I'm just going to sort of read through parts and skip around a little bit. So I have heard, so of course all sutras start like this. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in the eastern monastery, in the stilt longhouse of Migara's mother. Now at that time, Vasetta and Bharadvaja, I took one semester of Sanskrit, now I feel like I have to try to pronounce all these things correctly, even though it's Pali. So they were living on probation among the mendicants in hopes of being ordained. So these are, potential novice priests. Then in the late afternoon, the Buddha came downstairs from the longhouse and was walking in meditation in the open air beneath the shade of the longhouse. Vasetta saw him and said to Bharadvaja, Reverend Bharadvaja, the Buddha is walking meditation in the open air, etc., etc. Let's go talk to him. So they went, bowed, and walked beside him. Then the Buddha said to Vasetta, you are both Brahmins by birth and clan and have gone forth from the lay life to homelessness from a Brahmin family. I hope you don't have to suffer abuse and insults from the Brahmins. So these are, the Brahmins, they're the highest class, traditionally in the kind of ancient Indian system. So by becoming Buddhists, they're sort of giving all of that up. And the Buddha is saying, I'm hoping your fellow Brahmins aren't making fun of you, basically. And then, so he says, actually, sir, the Brahmins do insult and abuse us with their typical insults to the fullest extent. Then the Buddha says, but how do the Brahmins insult you? Sir, the Brahmins say, only the Brahmins are the highest caste. Other castes are inferior. Only Brahmins are the light caste. Other castes are dark. Only Brahmins are purified, not others. Only Brahmins are Brahma's rightful sons, born of his mouth, born of Brahma, created by Brahma, etc., etc. You've both abandoned the best caste to join an inferior caste, namely these shavelings, fake ascetics, riffraff, black spawn from the feet of our kinsmen. That is not right. It's not proper. That's how the Brahmins insult us. So, this is interesting because it's very clearly kind of racialized and the way that we would think about it now. And I looked at a few translations to make sure that these uses of dark and light weren't metaphorical, and it's pretty clear that they're not. So nowadays, my understanding is there's not really kind of a skin tone association with various castes, but at least at this time, it seems that that was the case. So let's see. So then the Buddha responds, actually, Vasetta, the Brahmins are forgetting their tradition when they say this to you. And then he says, they misrepresent the Brahmins, speak falsely, and make much bad karma. So the Buddha is clearly saying like this line of insult is not proper. All right, let's see. I don't want to read the whole thing here, so let me. So basically what he says in this part that follows is that in every caste, there are good people and bad people. The Brahmins don't have a monopoly on, good morality, and it's not the case that the lowest castes are, always doing bad things. They're good and bad in both. So it's pretty clear here that there's, an anti-racist message. So this is a particular issue that we can kind of pluck out and say like, okay, on this particular issue, there's clearly something that's being said. But actually in sort of the broader political sense, this sutra goes on to explain how we ended up in kind of the current, or how they ended up, I guess I should say, in the political situation that they found themselves in. So, all right, so there comes a time when, Vasetta, after a very long period has passed, the cosmos contracts. As the cosmos contracts, sentient beings are mostly headed for the realm of streaming radiance. There they are mind-made, feeding on rapture, self-luminous, moving through the sky, steadily glorious, and they remain like that for a very long time. So the idea here is like at the, after enough time has passed, the, cosmos expand and expand and expand. And then at some point there's this contraction, and everyone becomes sort of these disembodied like mind beings. There comes a time when, after a very long, I already said this, so expand, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but the single mass of water at that time was utterly dark. The moon and sun were not found, nor were stars and constellations day and night, months and fortnights, years and seasons, etc., etc. And after a very long period had passed, solid nectar curdled in the water. It appeared just like the curd on top of hot milk as it cools. So somehow this nectar appears floating in the air, and people start eating it. And then as they eat it, they become gradually kind of more solid. And then in the next part, the moon and the sun appear. And then at some point, the nectar disappears, and it's replaced by what they call ground sprouts. So it says, when the solid nectar had vanished, ground sprouts appeared to those beings. They appeared just like mushrooms. And so they eat these for a while, and then they disappear. And then there's what they call bursting pods, replace those. And then finally, rice appears. And then gender appears, and then sex begins. And so at this point, let's see, the rice is just sort of like constantly producing grains, and you don't even have to hull it. Like, it's very easy to eat. But at some point, that stops being the case, and they have to cultivate it like they do today. All right, so then those beings gathered together and bemoaned, "Oh, how wicked things have appeared among beings. For we used to be mind-made, feeding on rapture, self-luminous, etc." After a very long, and they go through all the different things that had happened. And then they say at the end here, so now the rice grains have become wrapped in powder and husk. It doesn't grow back after reaping. The cutting shows, and the rice stands in clumps. We'd better divide up the rice and set boundaries. So that's what they did. So this is the political origin story, starting here. All right, so now one of those beings was reckless. While guarding their own share, they took another's share without it being given and ate it. They grabbed that one who had done this and said, "You have done a bad thing, good being, in that while guarding your own share, you took another's share without it being given and ate it. Do not do such a thing again." "Yes, sirs," replied that being, but for a second time and a third time, they did the same thing and were told not to continue. And then they struck that being, some with fists, others with stones, and still others with rods. From that day on, stealing was found, and blaming and lying, and the taking up of rods. In the next section, so they again bemoan their situation. And let's see, so then those beings approached the being among them who was most attractive, good-looking, lovely, and illustrious, and said, "Come, good being, rightly accuse those who deserve it, blame those who deserve it, and banish those who deserve it. We shall pay you with a share of rice." "Yes, sirs," replied that being. They acted accordingly and were paid with a share of rice. Elected by the people, Vasita, is the meaning of elected one, the first term to be specifically invented for them. So this term, it means literally like great choice, and there's sort of like some play on, they do these like false etymology things a lot in Pali and Sanskrit texts, where they'll take a word and say it derives from this word, even if it doesn't, to make it sound good. And then the next one, Lord of the Fields, is the meaning of aristocrat. So aristocrat is Kshatriya, which is the caste that the Buddha was from. So they use this fanciful etymology to say that it actually means Lord of the Fields, implying that the Buddha is from this caste of this elected person who was supposed to rule over the rice fields. Okay, so, and then from here what follows is basically the origin of all of the remaining castes, and the conclusion is that you can be from any one of these castes, but they're all okay. But there is a subtext that the aristocrat caste is the best because that's the one the Buddha comes from. So even though it's kind of trying to make this message that we're all equal, it also wants to, say the Buddha is the best. So politically speaking, then, what can we kind of determine from this? So some commentators have looked at it and said, it seems like there was an election. They sort of elected this person. But then it also sort of says that the lineage of this person continues to be the ruler from then on. So there are no subsequent elections. So there's like an initial election, but then that's it. So there's also this sense that, this was done out of necessity. It's not like they wanted this kind of government oversight, so to speak, but they did it because, there was stealing and stuff going on and they needed to figure out a way to stop it. And also, I'll just mention that a lot of the later texts that comment on these are all like, even though the text doesn't say specifically that the Buddha has any relation to this guy who was elected, the later commentaries will all say that either the Buddha is directly descended from this person or that he was that person in a previous life. But those are all later commentaries. So he was the first king, according to the tradition, basically. Okay, so then there's another text that immediately follows this one in the Pali canon. And this one's called the Cakkavatti-Sīhanāda Sutta. So Cakkavatti is Chakravartin is the Sanskrit term, the wheel-turning king. And this one also has sort of an interesting kind of world cycle kind of thing going on in it too. And the basic idea here, let me see which, I wrote down which ones I want to talk about. Okay, so it begins by saying, monks, be islands unto yourself, be a refuge unto yourself with no other refuge. It goes on like this. So it's interesting that it starts with this sort of apolitical message, I guess you could say. And then it jumps into this, sort of an alternative or complementary, depending on how you view it, political origin story. So it begins with this time in history when everyone lives for 80,000 years. That's the average lifespan at this time. And the kingdom is ruled by this wheel-turning king, who is a king who rules in accord with the Dharma, and does everything to make it possible for people to practice, and himself, never does anything kind of immoral. And so let's see. There's a passage where he sort of asks about, he asks his ministers what he should do in order to make sure that, kind of he can continue to rule in this way. And basically what he says are, the precepts, like, the king himself has to follow the precepts in order to rule in a way that's appropriate. But after, I think it's like 7 generations of wheel-turning kings, things start to go wrong. So yeah, the 7th, let's see, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so basically the idea here is like there's this wheel treasure, and that kind of indicates that, you're ruling correctly. And when it disappears, that means you have to change something. So a man came to the king and said, "Sire, you should know that the sacred wheel treasure has disappeared." At this, the king grieved and felt sad, but he did not go to the royal sage and ask him about the duties of a wheel-turning monarch. Instead, he ruled the people according to his own ideas, and being so ruled, the people did not prosper so well as they had done under the previous king, who had performed the duties of a wheel-turning monarch. Then the ministers, counselors, treasury officials, guards, etc., came to the king and said, "Sire, so long as you rule the people according to your own ideas and differently from the way they were ruled under previous wheel-turning monarchs, the people do not prosper so well." And then they say you should ask your ministers how to do this. Right. So he has them come together, but he doesn't really listen to them. And so and it says here explicitly, so he did not give property to the needy, and as a result, poverty became rife. With the spread of poverty, a man took what was not given, thus committing what was called theft. They arrested him and brought him before the king, saying, "Your Majesty, this man took what was not given," which we call theft. The king said to him, "Is it true that you took what was not given?" And then he says, "It is, Your Majesty." "Why, Your Majesty?" "I have nothing to live on." Then the king gave the man some property, saying, "With this, my good man, you can keep yourself, support your mother and father, etc., etc. And then exactly the same thing happened with another man. Then people heard that the king was giving away property to those who took what was not given. And they thought, suppose we were to do likewise. And then several people do this. And then finally the king says, if I give property to everybody who takes what is not given, this theft will increase more and more. I had better make an end of him, finish him off once and for all, and cut off his head. So he commanded his men, bind this man's arm tightly, blah, 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 and basically execute him. Hearing about this, people thought, now let us too get sharp swords made for us, and then we can take from anybody what is not given by killing them. We will make an end of them, finish them off once and for all, and cut off their heads. So I think, again, this is another case where we can look at a particular political issue. Like this has a clearly like anti-capital punishment tone here. So it's basically saying that once the state starts executing people, it doesn't have the deterrent effect that we often might say it does, but rather it encourages more violence because it's sort of sanctioning violence for everyone, essentially, is the argument that's being made here. All right, so at any rate, this, things keep getting worse and worse, and then people start lying, and people's lifespans start decreasing, and it goes from 80,000 to 40,000 to 20,000, and new bad things keep getting added to the mix. And then let's see, go down verse 21 here. So finally, they get down to a 10-year lifespan. People are only living for 10 years. And so the Buddha says here, and then for those of a 10-year lifespan, there will come to be what's known as a sword interval of 7 days, during which they will mistake one another for wild beasts. Sharp swords will appear in their hands, thinking, this is a wild beast. They will take each other's lives with those swords. But there will be some beings who will think, let us not kill or be killed by anyone. Let us make for some grassy thicket or jungle recesses or clumps of trees, and live on roots and the fruits of the forest. And this they will do for 7 days. Then at the end of the 7 days, they will emerge from their hiding places and rejoice together of one accord, saying, good beings, I see that you are alive. And then the thought will occur to those beings, it is only because we became addicted to evil ways that we suffered this loss of our kindred. So let us now do good. What good things can we do? Let us abstain from the taking of life. That would be a good practice. And so they will abstain from the taking of life, and having understood this good thing, will practice it. And through having undertaken such wholesome things, they will increase in lifespan and beauty. And the children of those whose lifespan was 10 years will live for 20 years. And then it goes back in the opposite direction until you're back up to 80,000 years, and then you get another wheel-turning king. So what's interesting about this text is, it sort of takes monarchy for granted. There's no indication that, things would be better if you had elected officials or something. So it seems, with some limited evidence to the contrary, that, early Buddhism basically just took monarchy for granted. And two, the second interesting thing is that there's this clear indication that the rulers are only as good as the people themselves. But at the same time, the rulers do have an impact on the people. So there's this kind of interconnection. Things work both ways. So when things hit rock bottom, it's ultimately the people that start bringing the good kings back. But we started with the kings, sending things in a bad direction. So it works both ways here. And then the other thing is what finally turns things around is everyone taking this 7-day pause, and everyone just stops doing all their dumb stuff for a certain period of time, and then they, come back and start to make things good again. So there seems to be this subtext that, at a certain point we have to step back and fix ourselves before we can make things better. Okay, so that's that text. I'll go back to my notes here. Okay, and the last one that I'm going to talk about, last text, is the Mahāparinibbāna Sutta. So this is, it's a big text, and this is when the Buddha dies. But it starts off with something that's unrelated to that. And there's also a Mahayana version of this text that has the same title. but it's a totally different text. And it was, written much later. So this text begins, and this is sort of like maybe the counter argument to, maybe Buddhism does support some kind of republicanism or, representative form of government. But it's not very clear, but I'll read it to you and you can decide for yourself. So basically, this text starts off with the king of Magadha, Ajatasattu, who comes up occasionally in these Pali texts. And he decides that he wants to annihilate this group of people called the Vajjis. It's not clear why he wants to do this, other than just, because he wants to conquer more stuff, I guess. So they send one of his Brahmin ministers to the Buddha to ask him what the Buddha's advice on doing this, basically. He comes and gives the message to the Buddha that the king wants to kill these people. And the Buddha, he's with Ananda there, so he does kind of talks to the minister by talking to Ananda. So Ananda says, "What have you heard, Ananda? Do the Vajjis have frequent gatherings, and are their meetings well attended? I have heard, Lord, that yes, that this is so. So long, Ananda, as this is the case, the growth of the Vajjis is to be expected, not their decline. What have you heard, Ananda? Do the Vajjis assemble and disperse peacefully and attend to their affairs in concord? I have heard, Lord, that they do." And then again, it repeats this formula that so long as this is the case, they're expected to grow, not decline. The next one is, do the Vajjis neither enact new decrees nor abolish existing ones, but proceed in accordance with their ancient constitutions? Yes, they do. Do they show respect, honor, esteem, and veneration towards their elders and think it worthwhile to listen to them? And so on and so forth. So there are, a number of different things that they mention. And the idea is so long as they sort of follow their customary system of government, which seems to be more representative than what we've seen from these monarchical systems, they should be expected to grow and not decline. And so the sort of subtext here is, this is a good people, and if you try to invade them, you probably won't be successful because they've got things pretty well figured out. And it's unclear, I think, in the text if they actually do end up conquering them or not, but sort of besides the point. But then what they go on to do in this text is also say that the Sangha should be ruled in basically the same way, by having these frequent meetings, by people being in concord, following their traditions, and so forth. So it seems that this form of government is sort of a model for the Sangha itself. But it's not clear that, the Buddha thinks that this form of government is good for everyone else necessarily. All right, so those are the main texts. And, the people that have studied this stuff generally agree that despite the fact that there's some indication that kind of representative government, might be good, generally the texts take monarchy for granted, and certainly the later texts definitely do this. It seems that during the life of the Buddha, there were these village republics, they're called, that were at that time being consolidated into larger monarchies. So it seems that during the Buddha's lifetime, there was kind of a conflict between these two styles of government, but it's not clear that the Buddha had a clear preference one way or the other, and it sort of seemed, I think, inevitable that these monarchies would ultimately take everything over. All right. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the chapter in which he talks about this idea of limited citizenship, which is this, idea that government can do good, but maybe we should have a preference for practice over government engagement. Okay, so I already mentioned that, the Buddha explicitly sort of decided not to be a king in favor of being a religious person. So one of the things that he says in this regard about this idea of limited citizenship, so Moore, that is the author of this book that I was reading. So when we assess the role of politics and government, we are actually making two different judgments. So one is about the value of politics and government. What are its costs and benefits, and how can we maximize the benefits while minimizing the costs. But the second judgment is about the relative importance of politics. So political thinkers are obviously prone to assuming that politics is very important, but that's not to say that everyone has to have that opinion. And again, it's not to say that government is inherently bad and useless. You can still think it's good while still saying that I think my practice is more important than spending all my time on that stuff. Okay, so he defines this idea of limited citizenship as one, that politics are inevitable and often beneficial. Two, that it's sufficiently morally or practically important that thoughtful individuals need to sort of think seriously about their political decisions. Three, that politics ultimately is relatively unimportant when compared with other human concerns. And then finally, politics, relatively speaking, might not be as powerful a tool for helping other individuals achieve the truly important things in life. So that's how he defines this idea of limited citizenship, which he ascribes to early Buddhism, but also some Western thinkers, like I was saying, like Thoreau. So if you've read Walden Pond, there's sort of a similar kind of apolitical tone in his writings. All right, let's see what else. Oh yeah, and there's also another case where there's this person, his name is Chitta, he's a lay disciple. And when he's dying, there's this story that he should, the people around him are saying, you should wish to be reborn as a wheel-turning king. And he says, even this is impermanent and I do not wish it. And then, he dies. So there's another kind of bit of evidence that, Buddhism tends to be a little bit skeptical about how much good you can do through politics, early Buddhism at least. Another thing is that the kings are very often portrayed as being super wicked, bad people in the early Buddhist texts. They're killing their relatives and raping people and slaughtering babies and stuff, all kinds of really horrible stuff. So it's pretty clear that they don't think very highly of the political leaders of their time. And the Vinaya also has some specific prohibitions related to government. So the Vinayas are the texts that are for moral discipline of monks and nuns. For one thing, talk about politics is considered what they call animal talk. So this is, they have a list. So talking about armies, alarms, ministers of state, kings, robbers, food and drink, clothing, furniture, garlands, scents, relatives, vehicles, villages, towns, cities, women and heroes, etc. All these things they say are animal talk, and you should avoid talking about them. And also the Vinaya prohibits the Sangha from ordaining anyone who is a monk who has an obligation to the state. So if you're like an active duty soldier, or if you're a debtor or an escaped prisoner or something like that, you can't be ordained because they don't want to get involved in the sort of political, they don't want to have like a political conflict of interest, basically. And let's see, they're also, monks are not allowed to interact with the military, is another thing. And there's, all these rules have like origin stories, and the origin story for this one's kind of interesting. So it's like some monk, starts hanging out with these soldiers, and, they're talking about killing people, and the monk's like, hey, that killing people is actually bad and you shouldn't do it. And then all the soldiers, renounce killing and stop being soldiers. And then the, the generals and the king show up, to the Buddha, and they're like, hey, like you're taking all my soldiers from me. And so he, says that they shouldn't, again, create these conflicts between the state and individuals, even though it is something that Buddhists very clearly value, which is not killing. Again, different political context. It's probably harder to mess with a monarchy than it is to, express something in our current situation. But oh, and then finally, the the last sort of bit of evidence here is there is a kind of one instance, at least in Buddhist texts, where the Buddha himself kind of intervenes directly. And this is the case, so this comes from a Jataka tale, but actually it's depicting the Buddha, in his lifetime in this case. So the Jataka tales are generally about the Buddha's past lives. And there's this story where the Shakya clan that the Buddha comes from, they're told by, I believe it's the king of Kosala, it's one of the neighboring kingdoms. He demands that the Shakyas send kind of a woman of noble birth to marry their king. And that's against their customs, but they also don't want to anger the Kosalans because they're very powerful. So they sort of deceive them by sending this woman who is half of noble birth, but half of not noble birth, basically. And then they figure this out and, vow revenge against the Shakyas. And so they send a huge army to wipe out the, Buddha's clan. And the Buddha intervenes by sitting in meditation along the road. And I guess in, ancient India, it was like inauspicious to, initiate an assault after seeing a religious person on the way or something. So each time, they go and he's sitting there, and they ultimately go back and decide that they don't want to do it at that time. And the Buddha does this 3 times, often 3 is this important number. But they keep coming back every time. And finally, after the 3rd time, the Buddha says, I can't change the karma of this situation. And the 4th time, he doesn't show up, and they completely slaughter the Shakyas. So it's a pretty sad story. And, there's some indication that he's trying to do something, but ultimately he decides that he can't change what's sort of already been, the past karma that's already been set in motion. So let's see. Just really quickly, there are a few criticisms of this idea of limited citizenship, of course, that we see. The first is that it's kind of a form of parasitism, so that if you're not engaging with politics, you're just reaping the benefits that the government gives to you without, any input. But the basic response to this is that, there are plenty of people who want to be in government, so it doesn't necessarily need to be me. You're never going to run out of people to do that kind of work. And if you did, maybe we would step up and do it, but that's unlikely. Another claim is that basically it makes your views irrelevant. So by not participating in government, the chances of your views prevailing are unlikely. And again, Buddhism would, or early Buddhism would reject this because, its idea is that, we work from the bottom up by working on individuals, and it doesn't need to happen from the top down. Next, there's a claim of irresponsibility that if you don't participate in government, then you're basically ceding the field, that is CEDE, to people with worse morality than you. And again, the Buddhist response would basically be, if our primary concern is helping people to make moral and spiritual progress, the relative goodness or badness of the political situation is somewhat irrelevant, because it doesn't, it doesn't usually affect the individual all the time. And then finally, there's an argument of privilege, and this is sort of a more recent argument. So I don't know if anyone knows Slavoj Žižek. He's sort of like a pop philosopher. He has this essay about Western Buddhism, and he wrote that Western Buddhism enables you to fully participate in the frantic pace of the capitalist game while sustaining the perception that you were not really in it, that you are well aware of how worthless the spectacle is, and that what really matters to you is the peace of the inner self to which you know you can always withdraw. So this is kind of a privilege of quietism argument that most Western Buddhists tend to be middle-class white people, and they have the privilege to just sort of, do meditation on their own without having to worry about anything. And the author's response to this is, again, it's sort of a case of moral pluralism, he says. So again, of course, we can engage in the world and try to change the political system. That is one form of doing good. But the idea here is that, in Buddhism, if we can, help ourselves and help other people, then we can, again, create good citizens who will create good laws in the long run. But that being said, if you are just, not really sincerely, working to improve yourself and other people, then you are just sort of basking in your own privilege, and that would, of course, be bad. So we need to be conscious of the fact that, we shouldn't just be quietistic and completely inward, because the tradition doesn't advocate that either. All right, and with that, I will stop. And again, I'm not saying that this is the final word. I plan to give another talk where I'm going to look at some of the more socially engaged perspectives on Buddhism. And I don't think that they, I haven't investigated it yet, so I can't, pronounce my own personal judgment, but even if I did, it would just be my own personal judgment. So there are many ways to view this kind of situation. So any questions or comments? Yes, Mark.
All right. So obviously this has been on my mind a lot lately because, we're working on, some of the beneficial action piece of our message. And also politics has happened to define my entire career over and a lot of my engagement over the last 20 some years. And so it's something that, I kind of really think about a lot. And especially I like this idea of moral pluralism a lot, that, there's a lot of different ways in which you can kind of engage, like how you're using your time in order to benefit yourself and the people around you, whether it's like taking care of your kids, whether it's looking out for your neighbors, being there for your friends. Like a lot of those are apolitical ways of doing good, and they just kind of involve being a good person, being in tune to other people's needs, right? And so there's that. And then, we can say that there's also an extra, I guess, desire to be able to engage directly in the political sphere, whether that means being an activist, getting people elected, or writing your lawmakers, whatever the case may be. I served in as, in a political position in Monroe County for several years. And, there did tend to be kind of almost this point, in which you see the bulk of engagement being something that's positive and uplifting and working to benefit others, to the point where it just became, increasingly, I think, suffocating for a lot of folks. This happens, right around, you see high rates of, depression and anxiety have certainly marked a lot of folks over the last, 10, 15, 20 years, probably longer. But I think around, 2016, whatever may have happened nationally around that time, a lot of different kind of attitudes of people that were engaging and maybe that's just coming from just either just fatigue or just developing their entire identities around politics. But you see the, I guess, inclination to engage in a positive way is there's less of a desire to be able to engage in a positive way and more of a desire just to engage as it is. And so this is one of the things that, I was kind of thinking about, as you're talking about, for some early Buddhist folks, it's not necessarily the engaging in politics that's the important thing, but it's, the good people, or it's about, cultivating good people or cultivating a particular morality, and then, a better politics can emerge from there. That's not exactly what you said, but something that's related to that. And in some of the conversations I've had with Hoko, one of the things that, we're talking about is like, well, politics isn't, or beneficial action is not about politics, but politics should be about beneficial action. And so then placing that kind of piece first, and is the way that I'm engaging doing good, rather than is what I'm doing political or not political, or does it fall in line with this particular ideology or that political ideology? But one of the things that you said that kind of struck to me, and I think is actually important, I think I would probably, I have sympathy with the early Buddhists on this, is that idea of just kind of taking that break. You know, that kind of sitting back, turning it off, like turning off things for the time being, and to be able to kind of gather yourself and to be able to see kind of where you might exist and how you can actually engage in a way that is skillful. The problem is that is so hard to do in this day and age. I took a step yesterday. I actually deactivated my Facebook and Twitter accounts yesterday.
Good idea. Everyone should do that.
You know, but and especially since, you know, I work as the Associate Director of Political and Civic Engagement at IU, it's hard for me to not think about these things. And even though I know that sometimes I think about them in ways that are just a little bit unskillful. So I don't know if you have necessarily any thoughts on how in a modern context, we can actually disengage for a little bit in order to be able to, 7-day break is called the shit. That's actually a nice way of putting it. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if your studies have taken you anywhere in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically to the sort of point that you were making at the end there, I think that there are ways that, you know, even if we do want to engage politically, that we can, you know, step back a little bit. Because I think part of the modern condition with the internet and everything is that you know, there's just a fire hose of information, you know, being blasted at us all the time. And, you know, it makes us anxious and unhappy. And we don't really have much of an outlet immediately for most of these things. You know, we can work towards change, but we can't deal with every single little issue that we're hearing about all the time right now, you know? So I think that there's, you know, probably a healthier way to ingest all of the media, you know, to sort of slow it down a little bit. So I think what you mentioned about Facebook and Twitter, you know, setting boundaries with that sort of thing. Also with, like, for me, like I've always been a news junkie, and I probably spend like an hour every day reading the news, and, you know, I don't really get much benefit out of it. You know, like I'm well informed, I guess, but you know, I'm not really able to act on it most of the time. So yeah, I think that there are little steps that we can take. You know, one thing that I did recently was, and I've done this multiple times and gone back and forth, but I got rid of my phone because I'm at home all the time anyways, and I can use my computer when I have to, but at least I'm not, like, you know, in my bed before going to sleep, you know, doom scrolling. So yeah, I mean, I think what you said there, you know, any way that we can sort of step back a little bit. I mean, I think it's almost impossible nowadays to completely, like, disengage. Even if you tried, it would be pretty hard. And so I think that, yeah, it's important to keep ourselves sane and do the change that we can do, but realize that we can't change everything. And, you know, sort of being conscious of every little thing isn't going to lead to us doing good necessarily, you know. So I don't know if that's helpful, but. Any other questions or thoughts? Mark.
Thank you.
Sorry. Mark and then Jeff, sorry.
Thanks very much for your talk, or the beginning of your talk. That's what I'm gathering you're really doing, is developing a story. And so about today's story, is it fair to say that what you're doing is kind of laying out an evolutionary picture of thoughts about these issues about politics and individual life, and if so, is the story, is that the case? Should I go on?
I'd say that, yeah, that's sort of part of it. I guess that, you know, it's helpful because, you know, the tradition, of course, has changed a lot over time, and especially in the past 150 years. And I think that by examining kind of all of the available evidence that we have about what the tradition advocates is going to be, you know, the real way to get at, you know, what the tradition might recommend. Some of it, of course, we have to sort of extrapolate because they weren't dealing with the same conditions that we are. And that, of course, is going to be in modern materials. So it's not necessarily just to lay out an evolutionary picture, but to sort of examine all the available evidence and through that try to decide on a proper course of action. And also it's going to be different, I think, for ordained people and lay people. You know, the tradition has always been pretty clear that there are different roles for both people. So I think what applies to me as you know, someone in my position in this community is maybe a little bit different from what it might be for a lay person. So at any rate, yeah, that's kind of the basic idea.
So I'm just wondering, I probably can answer this for myself, but I'm sure it's not linear, like a simple linear story of evolution. And
yes,
whether it's so context dependent. But is there a gradual, I mean, should we be attuned as your talks proceed through time, that there's going to be an accumulation of sophistication and nuance in the analyses, or the issues can be just the same, and we should just be looking at different variations and context dependent treatments of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets more and more messy, would be probably the better way to describe it, because the tradition, you know, was of course sort of unitary at the beginning, and the Sangha's relationship to the state didn't change all that much, you know, for most of pre-modern history. So there wasn't, you know, at least according to this book, not much development in the way that the Sangha interacted with the state. And the changes sort of started with colonialism. So suddenly you had this influx of Western ideas. And one of the things that this book examines was the transition from monarchy to republicanism cynical or principled? That is to say, you know, were Buddhist majority governments adopting republicanism because they thought it meshed well with Buddhism, or just because it was, you know, convenient or impossible to avoid? And he looks at the cases of a number of different countries, and he basically determines that so Burma actually clearly was investigating the idea of switching to Republican government before it was sort of foisted upon them, and they tried to look at Buddhist principles and see how it might line up. And then also the case of Tibet with the Dalai Lama's many writings on, you know, government that he's done over his career. But in most other cases, it was much more of a kind of cynical approach. And, you know, in Cambodia, I think was like sort of the worst case, you know, where you have the, you had sort of a monarch who ultimately ended up supporting the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot because he had grievances with, you know, the previous government. He was claiming to be doing this in the name of Buddhism, and, you know, it had very bad results, obviously. So, you know, there's kind of a whole range of things that have happened. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
I'll stay tuned.
Yeah. And then, yeah, of course, this book doesn't really get into engaged Buddhism, but that's, you know, another thing that I want to investigate is sort of the past 50 years, especially, or I guess 70 years or so. So Mark, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The other Mark.
The other Mark.
What's politics? I mean, what is politics? As we sit here talking about Buddhism and politics, and as we're looking at the origins of politics and Buddhism, it's not so clear what politics is.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. For the purposes of this book that I was looking at, you know, he has sort of a strict definition where, you know, he defines politics as the sorts of things that involve kind of direct engagement with government or political people or laws. But of course, you can talk about politics writ large, and I think that that's important to consider too. And in that sense, Buddhism, you know, could be considered extremely political. So the figure of the Buddha himself fundamentally sort of changed the way that governments ran themselves, because as countries became Buddhist majority, the governments needed to support the Sangha and rule in such a way that was acceptable to the, you know, Buddhist kind of, I don't know, moral sensibilities, basically. So in that sense, the Buddha's mission was extremely political. And there's also in this book a discussion of a Mennonite who had sort of also a limited citizenship sort of theory. And he makes the same claim about Jesus, so that even though Jesus himself was apolitical, he had enormous political impacts. So there is also this broader sense of interconnection where any act is kind of political. And in that sense, you know, we can't avoid it, of course, nor should we try to. So what he's talking about is just the more limited sense. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
So you're just basically saying it's participation with government.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like providing my own definition.
Yeah.
You know, just saying
Well,
that. Yeah.
well, that's, I mean, that I know you're not providing your own definition, but that seems to be that seems to be the working model, and that, yeah, I've always looked at it a little bit differently. I've looked at it as a way of a reallocation of liberty. You know, we're free to do whatever we want, you know, but when you start working and living with others, those freedoms are limited or become limited. And it is appropriation of some of those liberties taken away from you and reappropriated to others that are not so benefited. Well,
Yeah, that's the social contract theory, basically.
Yeah, welfare programs, etc.
Yeah, and that sutta that I read about the rice fields, you know, the author of this book more sort of analyzes that as sort of a form of social contract. But I guess the difference is in like non-Western traditions, they don't have this assumption of like the individual as having rights. That's, you know, a pretty Western thing. So the degree to which it's sort of a meaningful social contract is kind of debatable because, you know, they didn't necessarily have any rights that they were giving up in their frame of view. But, you know, it's getting in sort of to minutia. But yeah, certainly I think that that's a fruitful like form of analysis, is thinking about government as a social contract. Is that, I don't know if that helps other Mark, but okay, Russ.
Unmute, I did it. Oh, this is such a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is so much to chew on here. I'll be chewing for a while on this. Just a couple things. I want to talk with you more and get that citation of the origin of the world sutta.
Sure, I can put it into the chat.
Because that was so interesting about the Brahmins shaming those two novices because of color.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I want to look into this more. I do believe I've read some things that suggest that the caste system in India really is arrayed on the basis of color, not just between the Brahmins and everyone else. But I don't know that for sure. So I think it's really interesting. Also, I'd recommend a book by Isabel Wilkerson on caste. Our system of racial discrimination in this country is in fact a caste system. And she's got some pretty interesting writings about a journalist from India who came over from the lowest caste. And when he sees some of the commentators that are on, you know, CNN or MSNBC, who most of them are more likely to be able to have gotten here to this country because they were richer. And so, but when he sees them, it's like he has this like almost visceral reaction, because these are people who would have dominated him in India. Anyway, that whole thing about seeding the field, the criticisms of the limited citizenship, as seeding the field to others. You know, you and I have talked about the fact that a lot of the activists in the 70s, Russ included, kind of dropped out and moved to the farm. And I didn't quite eat roots and berries, but I believe that it was, incumbent upon us to kind of withdraw. And I really do think that ceded the field to others. And so I'm thinking that it's meaningful that it said 7 days, that we need 7 days to step back. But I wonder whether it ought to go much beyond that 7 days. And then I think, as always, Hojo-san's thoughts are really relevant. And I put something in there from him on the chat that relates to Indra's net and how we can all just contribute in small ways to creating change. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I have a real question, but those are just some of the things that came to mind.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I want to tread carefully about caste because last time Shoryu was giving a talk and he mentioned something about the racialization of caste in modern India, and there was an Indian American person in the audience who didn't agree. So I don't want to assume anything, but it seems clear enough that at least in the time of the Buddha, that that was the case. At least we can see it here, and also historically, there was a migration of Indo-Europeans into northern India, and that's where the modern Indo-European languages that are spoken in India came from. And there was sort of this this happens a lot with languages where you get sort of like a prestige language and like sort of an under language. Happened in English with French being the kind of prestige language and Anglo-Saxon being the sort of sub language, I don't know. And so over time, it seems that probably numerically the number of like Indo-Europeans that came in were not that great. So over time they assimilated with the people that were already in India. But at least initially, within some X number of years after that Indo-European invasion, there probably would have been a pretty stark difference in skin tone, knowing what we know about, because the Indo-Europeans came from like the Ukraine, probably. But I think over time it seems to have subsided a little bit. But I don't know too much beyond the sort of linguistic stuff. Related to seeding the field, it was interesting because you used the same terminology when we spoke before, and that's actually what the book had, the same term, seeding the field. And I was thinking about that, and you can also think of it as seeding the field, like SEED. Like maybe one of the things that we can do as practitioners is seed the field with good people who will go on to do good things potentially in government. So I think maybe one potential model is it might be important to have sort of a mix, and I think maybe like the lay priest divide is one way to think about it. Having some group of people who sort of embrace this limited citizenship approach, but they're teaching people who don't take that approach, so that we have kind of a mix of both things. And certainly the tradition doesn't place the same prohibitions on lay people as it does to priests. So I think that that's an important consideration as well. So I don't know if that addresses things very much, but a few little thoughts.
I think we'll probably be doing a lot of addressing over the next. So it's a great start. Thank you.
Thank you. Hennesis, and then Hoko.
So this question might be a bit malformed, and I've been trying to figure out how to word it for like 10 minutes, but basically I was kind of curious about, so I mean, I'm thinking about the whole origin of the concept of separation of church and state originated from people who were afraid not of religion influencing people's lives, but of the state corrupting religion. And I was reading this book talking about, Imperial Japan, and sort of how like oftentimes like the state played a huge role in engineering Buddhism, and that the precedent for this goes back all the way to King Ashoka. And I was wondering what your thoughts were, sort of like, you know, you're talking a lot about sort of like the early suttas and stuff, but like sort of how rulers have influenced, I guess, our perceptions of these concepts that you're discussing.
So I think, yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a religious studies person, so I could talk all day about separation of church and state. But, you know, I think the important thing maybe to realize with that is, you know, the phrase separation of church and state comes, you know, from a letter that Jefferson wrote to some, you know, religious people. It's not actually really a government policy. You know, what the Constitution says is that, you know, that the state can't have its own kind of state religion, and also that it won't impede on the free exercise of people's religion. So obviously there isn't really a separation between church and state, because you get presidents, you know, talking about Judeo-Christian values all the time and so forth. And, you know, obviously they can do that and get away with it. So yeah, I mean, I think that, so the question then is sort of like, how do rulers affect religion? Is that kind of basically the idea?
More specifically, how you think that rulers have influenced our understanding of, I guess, like Buddhism and its relation to politics.
Yeah.
I guess, like specifically Buddhist rulers, like in India, China, etc.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So in another book that I was reading, the person hints at the fact that as Buddhism moved around, the sort of conceptions of kingship that existed in various places seemed to have impacted, you know, what proved to be popular within Buddhism in those places. So, you know, they talk about, you know, in Central Asia, which was under the sort of Persian sphere of influence, you know, they had this idea of the king as like sort of being like a sun king. And it seems that Vairochana Buddha became very popular there, and he's displayed in a very similar way as, you know, having like a big radiant sun behind his head and so forth. And then in East Asia, in China, the Amitabha Buddha became very popular, who, you know, is basically like the monarch of the Pure Land in, you know, the Western heaven, basically. And it seems that there's some relationship between the Chinese conception of, you know, kind of the heavenly mandate, basically, to be the emperor, and the popularity of Amitabha Buddha as sort of a similarly portrayed figure. So that's one way in which there's sort of an interaction. But also, of course, I think that esoteric Buddhism, for example, it seems that, you know, there's been some work by historians that suggest that the importance of like mantras and these different like spiritual technologies that developed that were supposed to basically help kings like win wars and stuff, seem to have had a pretty direct origin from kind of the needs of monarchs to, you know, win their battles or whatever. And the Buddhists were sort of saying, oh, like, you know, the Hindus have all that stuff, but like we can offer you this stuff, so, you know, patronize us. So yeah, there's definitely a give and take that has gone on over time. And then more recently in Japan, you know, much of Japanese Buddhist modernism was the result of Buddhists basically being like cut off after the modernization of Japan in favor of Shinto. So the Buddhists like totally changed their approach to things to try to ingratiate themselves to the government. So yeah, there are definitely interactions there. Too many to talk about. But those are a few. Hoko, I guess we're probably running short on time here, huh?
Yeah, and in that vein, I'll just wanted to point back to your origin story, because I thought the perception of darkness and light was very interesting. And this is something that shows up throughout the tradition, down through the Mahayana, through Soto Zen. So, you know, in a Western culture, we might say, well, light is good and darkness is scary. You know, dark is somehow less valuable than light. So I thought it was really interesting in your story how in the beginning there is darkness, and there, you know, that the nature of that darkness is non-separation. and that the more there was separating out, the more there was splintering out, right? Somehow the more suffering there was. You know, people start arguing with each other, hurting each other, taking each other's stuff. So it's really interesting how, you know, in our culture, we would see that maybe the opposite. So when we look around at something like the Sandokai, you know, there's darkness, but don't take it as darkness, and there's light, but don't take it as light. These things are not actually separate. You know, in amongst all of our conversation about the very specific outcomes of that, you know, how does government work? How do politics work? If you want to take politics as involvement with government, or politics simply as decision-making by groups, which is what, you know, in the largest sense, what politics is. You know, in the midst of all of that, here we can come back to something which is quite broad and pervades the tradition, which is simply our perception of darkness and light. You know, and there are ramifications for that, for how we treat people and people who are different than ourselves and all of that kind of thing. And yet, you know, there's this other way to look at darkness and light, which is darkness is, you know, in darkness, we don't separate. In darkness, all cats look gray, right? So something underlying that I think is very interesting. And I loved how that story kind of pointed out, the more we divide, the more we splinter off, the more we create division and create separation, the more likely we are to butt heads. So it's true that we have distinction, and it's also true that underlying that we have this non-separation. So I thought that was a really helpful story. And just as an aside, Doju, could I ask you to make a list of the various citations you had today, and we'll post those on the Beneficial Action resource page so that people who are involved with that can do more investigating of the things you were talking about today. A very interesting talk. I thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be happy to share those resources that I looked at. And just to be, you know, clear about that, I think, yeah, the origin story where it's sort of saying that there's no sunlight or moonlight or anything at the beginning, and then, you know, the sun and the moon appear sort of as things separate and as people move from this state of just being mind-made to being physical creatures. In that case, yeah, I think the dark is good, but there also is the racialized, you know, part of that same text where it's obviously not doing the same thing. So I just want to make that clear. Yeah, I think that that's all that are there any kind of last minute questions, or should we wrap up? Good. All right, well, thank you, everyone. And Hoshin, whenever you're ready. Oh, is Hoshin stuck? Oh, there he is.
It seems like I'm dropping out, so bear with me again.
No worries.
I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible.